Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk to you about the work I do at Stanford with military medicine and the Muse, and the Muse in the form of literature and writing. Now, at first glance, it may not be obvious what the connections are between those three disparate entities. And my talk today will be the story of how I came to be doing this work. And hopefully through that story, those connections will be illuminated. I'd also like to share something with you today that I've learned through this process, and hopefully you can take that out in the world with you. So I love that the theme today is uncharted waters, because that is what I found myself in when I was on this boat, headed out to Alcatraz Island to swim the 1.5 miles into Aquatic Park. I was participating in the Veteran Swim Challenge with several of my military-affiliated students from Stanford. One of those students, Derek, is a Navy SEAL. And so I said to Derek, I am so glad you are doing this swim because if something happens to me, you could save me. And he said, oh no ma'am, I'm trained to kill, not to save. And we laughed. And then later though, it really hit home to me again what it is we ask our young men and women to do when they join the military. And that is, go through boot camp training, Navy SEAL training, Army Ranger training to get to the point where they have the capacity to take another human life. And that's not how we're wired as humans. We are, our instinct and impulses for caring and compassion, even young babies show a tendency toward that. And we have part of our vagus nervous system that is activated when we are feeling sympathy or sympathetic. So the military understands that, so as the Marines say, we have to break you down to build you back up with this training. So the only problem with that is there's no reboot camp for when soldiers come back home. And so sometimes that transition can be very difficult. In addition, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been the two longest wars in our country's history, fought by less than 1% of the population. Compare that to World War II, which was half as long, fought by 10% of the population. So we have a very small population carrying the burden of these wars. And today actually is March 20th is the anniversary of our invasion of Iraq 14 years ago. So there's an organization, wonderful organization, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and they have developed a PSA for people like myself who do not have military experience to understand what that isolation might feel like when they come home. So I'd like to play that for you now. It's just about a minute long.
Welcome home, man.
My experience with the military, my father and sister were in the Navy, and when I was about your age, looking to go to university, I wanted to go to the Naval Academy. And I made it as far as the medical physical, and I remember it like it was yesterday, the doctor listening to my heart, and basically he found 2 ailments that were minor, but were major enough to keep me out of the military. So I went to Plan B, and I went to the College of William and Mary in Virginia and studied history and English, had a wonderful experience, and went on to a career in publications and media relations, and raised 3 wonderful children, and was not too involved with the military until about 7 years ago. I was working in a medical school in Texas and going to graduate school in the field of medical humanities and the arts. And during that time, a friend of mine's son completed 3 tours in Iraq, and then he came home and he died by suicide. And at the time, I was trying to help my friend through this process and understand how someone could survive war and not the homecoming. And in the process, I found out that more soldiers had died from suicide than combat in both of those wars. So this just broke my heart. And while heart ailments kept me out of the military, this kind of heart ache and wanting to help in some way re-engaged me with the military. So Time magazine, this was 2012, covered this epidemic that a veteran one a day had committed suicide over a year. And we actually now know those numbers are actually a little bit larger. So I decided to do my thesis work on this issue to look into what was happening. And a couple of things. Physiologically, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan involved more IEDs, improvised explosive devices, than any of the conflicts we've ever been in. And these young men and women who are fighting are over there for longer deployments and multiple deployments. So the concussive blast from the IEDs and the cortisol from being in constant fight-flight response causes physiological changes to the brain. And that leads to things like TBI and post-traumatic stress disorder. But there was another thing that was happening where soldiers couldn't talk about what happened. They just couldn't tell their story. And I just called that post-traumatic story disorder. And there were multiple factors that went into that. But what I found was if I talked about either a story or a movie, it was easier for the veteran to then relate to the incident in that book or story, and then go on and talk about their experience. So while I was doing this and doing this research, I was working full-time at the medical school, and one day I got a really tragic phone call that one of our medical students had committed suicide. And he was a wonderful young man. His father was a physician, his 2 older brothers were physicians. And in helping his family, they wanted to set up a scholarship in Justin's name and also a program at the medical school for medical students who might be suffering from depression, because they discovered that their son indeed had suffered from depression but couldn't reach out to help, to ask for help. Well, in the course of that, Justin's dad got hundreds of letters from physicians all over the country talking about their struggles with burnout and depression. And so at this point, I saw very sadly this commonality between the military and medicine in terms of a higher suicide rate than the national average, but also at the same time, 2 professions that we as a society really elevate and admire. A recent Pew Research study said that the medicine and military are the 2 highest, most respected professions in our country. So I started to see other similarities too. Hierarchy, life and death decisions, extensive training, uniforms, not being able to necessarily always have control over where you're going, either if it's a residency match or where you're deployed. And then in talking to one of the surgeons, he said, we're either a hero or a zero. Something doesn't go right in the operating room. There's sort of no in between. And when he said that, I said, that's a white coat you're wearing, not a cape. But I realized too, what I was hearing from physicians and soldiers, there were a lot of similar themes as having high expectations for themselves and society having high expectations as well. So once I started talking to the physicians, I changed how I interacted with doctors, particularly when I was sick. And I would go in and the first time I said to my doctor, well, how is your day? How are you doing? And she just about fell off her chair in the office. She was sort of surprised. But I started to hear their stories about, how difficult it is to tell a patient they have an inoperable tumor or their child is going to die. And like the soldiers, they were carrying these stories with them without sort of an outlet to share. So as a result of my thesis work, I was asked to lead a literature and medicine class at the VA hospital. And this class was developed by the Maine Humanities Council as a way for the physicians at veterans hospitals to better understand the veteran experience, because most of them don't have military experience themselves. And this proved to be a real oasis for the physicians who, having a stressful day. Not only did it improve their empathy for their patients, but it improved their own job satisfaction and connection with their colleagues. Now, I know at your stage in life, literature might not quite seem like an oasis to you, but when you've been out and working and raising a family, to re-engage with that art form can be quite refreshing and rejuvenating. So I was really thrilled when I came to Stanford to have the chance to work with the Physician Wellness Committee there and Dr. Genovese to create this literature and medicine dinner and discussion series. And since we don't treat mostly veterans there at the hospital, what we read are stories by doctors, about doctors, by patients, about patients, by writers, everybody from Oliver Sacks to Mary Oliver to Abraham Verghese to Rebecca Solnit and Ursula Le Guin, just a whole variety. And so when I did this, I decided I really would love to do this for our military-affiliated students. And then I found out that the creative writing program at Stanford was actually inspired by the World War II veterans coming home. And Wallace Stegner, famous writer who started the program, said his students had so much to say and were such gifted writers. And so I was fortunate able to do that. And I have learned so much from the students in the class. We read more literature, and then we do writing, different writings, but based on different prompts, either the reading or what we talk about. And so one of the things I wanted to share with you today is that, we as a society, we're into this thank you for your service that we say to veterans, and that's great, but we can extend that conversation very easily and just ask the next question, like, what was it like over there, or why did you choose that branch of service? Or something even more basic than that. In one of my classes, I asked, what's it like to wear night vision goggles? Like, all of us have probably seen that in the movies or a video game, but what was it like? So one of my students, George, actually wrote a beautiful poem about what that's like. And so in the spirit of perhaps looking with new eyes at the people who serve us in our life, in the military and the medicine, and the medical field, I'd like to close by reading George's poem. Night Vision by George Hodgins. The sky is inviting when it is green. I once counted 12 shooting stars in a 5-minute span while kneeling on an Afghan plateau waiting on a helicopter to see when others can't. With the flick of my head and the power of a AA battery, I became Superman. I could watch through a green lens as other Supermen silently entered windows, climbed aboard ships at sea, or walked through the mountains. I had a front row seat to a show that the human eye was not meant to see. My purpose was clear when everything was green. Green hides the color of blood. It makes eye contact impossible, and man does it light up the night sky. Thank you.